in which they work. When you look at gay and lesbian, gay and lesbian groups, it is an equal fight for civil rights, but through a different lens, through a lens that their lives have merit and they deserve the same basic rights that are granted to heteronormative populations that we often take for granted. So identity politics really looks at these groups that are framed around some collective experience and identity, then how these groups navigate through politics, how they vote, how they protest, how they engage with their elected officials, how they respond to other social phenomenon from other minoritized groups. And so all of this collectively is what we're looking at when we use the term identity politics.
Great. When I think of identity politics, I think about what drives a voter. And what I mean by that is what drives the voter to participate in the democracy. What we know, what I know as a Black scholar is that oftentimes African Americans feel that they have the option of not voting. And they have an option of not voting due to the fact that the system has never represented them. And so when I think about identity politics, I think about what identities are people attaching themselves to that drive a civic participation. And as Dr. Lewis has excellently expounded, those identities usually organize themselves around religious beliefs, around sexual orientation or gender, around race. And so those are the things, for me, that is the driving factor. What drives people to participate in the electoral process, and the foundation for participating is voting.
Dr. Nelson, when you talk about the identity politics, it seems to me like that was something that I only heard, because I'm not a political scientist, I only heard that term as just a voter and a participant in a democracy around the Clinton-Trump election in 2016. I hadn't heard that term used before. How long would you say that the scholarship and the activism around identity politics has actually been present in this country?
I would argue that it's been present since Black Studies was founded. So when we first start seeing Black politics develop as a discipline, that's when I believe that what we study as far as political identity started showing up. So I would say that it dates back to the start of Black Studies. However, I think it became mainstream in the 2016 election, and I think it became mainstream during that time frame because of the intersections in which we are seeing candidates. So it was after a Barack Obama and the intersections in which he represented, right, by being someone of mixed heritage, that we then started the idea that other people that were going to come and run for office were going to be living at intersections that we had not discussed and that we had not explored previously. And so I believe that's why it became something that was talked about more in 16, is because of the fact that we did have a Barack Obama that was the president, and he represented something totally separate than what we had seen inside of that White House before he was president.
Gotcha. Great.
I also think a pillar for identity politics, at least in terms of race, goes back to 1903, when W.E. Du Bois wrote The Souls of Black Folks. He said that Black people have a dual identity, that they have to be one person in the collective presence of Blacks, and then a different person in the collective presence of whites. And that was largely framed around the legal manifestations of racial discrimination under the Black codes that Black people had to deal with. So identity politics has been around for over a century. It has become more mainstream in recent years. But when we look at the history of the theoretical writings of James Baldwin, W.E. Du Bois, we see the legacy of identity politics has been around for at least a century.
Yeah, and Dr. Lewis, you must have read my mind, because I was just going to ask you your opinion on Frederick Douglass, James Baldwin, W.D. I mean, so I know at that time, of course, we had a piece of paper that said Black people were 3/5 human and they didn't have a right to vote until sadly, way into the 1900s, right, that it actually became legitimate. But that's not to say that there was not Black political activism happening from, right, the inception of this country.
And you bring up a good point. You bring up Frederick Douglass, and I think Frederick Douglass's speech on the floor of Corinthian Hall in New York, when he talks about what to the slaves, the Fourth of July, was one of your most historical moments of political activism. Here is a black man who very well could be killed for the truth that he's about to speak about the hypocrisy of America, and he does so without flinching and without fear of his own well-being. That is political activism personified, that an individual has to relinquish self-preservation to reveal some fallacy of the system to promote the collective good of their identity.
But
Absolutely.
I mean, and I guess I would argue that Black women have been at the forefront or at the head of that
Mm-hmm.
since the beginning. I mean, if we think about this, if we think about if we think about Harriet Tubman, if we
Mm-hmm.
think about activism from a place of not only just escaping herself and then allowing others to escape, but by performing specific roles in shaping the American conscience, and then activating that conscience by going back and participating in battles during war and during that piece of the Civil War. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think what's even more important to Tim's point or to Dr. Lewis's point is this idea that that Black Americans been have been consistently asking America to view them as the citizens that they have acted like since the beginning. And the idea of a lack of citizenship really in many ways pushes this narrative of identity politics, and also plays into the reason why some people feel that at this point, is it even worth participating when we have pushed the structure since its inception?
Absolutely. And I was actually going to ask you, Dr. Nelson, about Ida B. Wells. I mean, who I kind of see as the heart and the beginning and the core of the movement for Black lives, right? As she goes out there and puts her life on the line to stop the lynching, right? That was just rampant at the time. Although she had no political power, technically, she did, right? And I think I'm looking maybe for you to help kind of frame how someone without that right to vote and without that kind of systemic political power, kind of Ida B. Wells, James Baldwin, that kind of thing, actually became kind of the forefront of huge political movements that shape identity politics that we talk
Well,
about today.
yeah, to me, it goes back. You know, many people always laugh at me because I always take it back here. To me, it always goes back to this idea of the social contract. It goes back to Hobbes saying that there's a social contract that if the citizens do certain things, then the states should do other things, right? And he establishes this code of morality and then how the society should actually work, or how things should play out. And so what Black women have done is they've held up the system to that leisure, right? So if you mention Ida B. Wells or talk about Ida B. Wells, she was excluded from marching. They asked her in the suffrage movement to march in the back, right? And instead of marching in the back, she protested by not marching at all. And establishing then a different march. And so when we think about when we think about Ida B. Wells, when we think about if we think about Mary Cloud Bethune, if we think about there are several women, Black women, there are several Black men who have pushed the system, and Black women have been at this kind of crux, or at this weird intersection, because they are in some ways a double minority. By being a woman and then having their race as another intersection in which they have to live in, it makes it very difficult. But I would again state though that how does someone do it? They do it by holding up what you agreed on in the social contract. They hold up the Constitution. They hold up the Bill of Rights, and they participate in these actions by holding up those rights and by holding them up and saying that you promised this. This is not what the reality for Black women, for Black men, for people of other minority groups. And until it is so, we will continue to march.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, great way to kind of bring that all together. I wanted to kind of ask you guys, because I am like a political junkie. I will watch my 24-hour cable news to find out the news of the day. But we all know whether any channel that you're watching has some kind of bias. But particularly for me, I look at how the candidates' campaigns are manipulating identity politics in order to gain votes or gain more support for their candidates. Can you guys kind of help me understand how that works around the black white lines as far as that identity, the more racial identity?
So I'll start off by saying this. We are in a moment in history where there is the gasp, the last gasp of white power. White supremacy is a myth. It is not the truth of the world order. It is what's invented to then allow for whites to then maintain power. And so, what we're seeing at this moment, and what we're seeing is really the last gasp for power. And we're seeing white folks that are frightened. Honestly, we are seeing them frightened about the fact that the lies that they've told are crumbling, and we are seeing them play themselves out, which is why they will blindly follow a man that has no intellect, or doesn't have a superior enough intellect to sit inside of the White House and then run the country. That they will choose him because he represents a sense of superiority that they long for and that they are looking after, which is why we explicitly saw the president say to groups that feel that way to stand by, to stand back and stand by, right? Not stand down, but stand back and stand by. The idea that I am supreme is what we see many in the white electorate having to face the falsehood of such a narrative.
Absolutely.
I think when we talk about these campaigns trying to appeal to identity politics, I think it's a direct result of what happened in 2018, not 2018, 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not talking about just the election of Barack Obama.
Mm-hmm.
Barack Obama won the presidency without getting a majority of the white vote. Barack Obama only got 42% of the white vote. That means that he secured the presidency by securing the minority vote. Now, how is that possible? That has been a trend in the United States at least since the 1960s, and that will likely be fulfilled by the year 2045, where the number of minorities are increasing in the United States. And the census projects that by the year 2045, white people will no longer be the statistical majority. So this appeal to identity politics is out of necessity. They don't have a choice because now they see, one, that the white population is declining with respect to other racial groups, and that you can actually win a presidential election without getting the majority of the white vote. So what they are doing is they are actually playing a political game. They are not sincere in their appeal to racial minorities. This is the standard that I use when I am trying to see if someone is sincere. There's a phrase that says that communication is both verbal and nonverbal. And we usually use that phrase to say that, well, someone's actions should speak louder than their words. But if you take that phrase in the most basic sense, communication is verbal and nonverbal. It means that communication is what people say and what they don't say. When I am listening to campaign ads, when I'm listening to a candidate's platform, I'm listening to what they don't say. When they don't directly affirm that racial discrimination is inherent in the American system, when they don't affirm that there are racial disparities currently in the United States for racial minorities, when they don't have a plan to address police brutality, when they don't have a plan to address that Black women are more likely to die in childbirth or have their child die in the process of childbirth, when they don't have a plan to address immigration, when they don't have a plan to address prison reform, they don't have a plan to address the school to prison pipeline, what they don't say lets you know really where they stand on racial issues.
But I would push back and say that many of them, but the presence of those, right, are also a dog whistle to those who believe otherwise, right? To have a platform, to have a platform. If we go back to Elizabeth Warren, before we get down to these two candidates, if we go back to Elizabeth Warren, who had a very robust plan for historically Black colleges and universities, that position alone turned off a certain number of voters, right? There was a certain number of voters who were are automatically turned off by the idea that you have in any way itemized what you are going to do for any minority group. And so just the same way, by just the same way of them not saying it, right? Them saying it also is a them saying it or putting any level of effort towards it, let me say it that way, it's also a clear signal, because that means they have lost the ability to court a particular group. And that's a decision that each campaign is making, by saying that I will prefer to court this group and then secure these votes versus courting this group. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. Many people, for Trump right now, the gap, that one of the biggest reasons he won is because 51% or so of white women voted for Trump in 2016. That number has shrunk down to almost 36%. I mean, it's staggering how low or how much he's dropped. And so in many ways, there has been this attempt to court what they would consider to be the suburban white woman voter, right? But by having a platform where you're talking about police brutality, right, it's going to immediately detract some of those suburban white women as voters. So I think that what we have to understand here is what Dr. Lewis says is exactly correct. They've been forced to play this game, but the Republicans, when forced to play the game in 2008, went the opposite direction and alienated many of the Latino and Latina voters. And so what we see as an action also has an alternate consequence for making certain choices. And we've seen those choices be made, I think, ever strongly in 2020 in a way that we didn't necessarily see them made in previous years.
I guess my question is, I mean, I see the necessity piece, especially with the minority numbers increasing and that need to kind of protect the whiteness and the white supremacy that keeps the system functioning. But my curiosity is what your guys' opinion on is how and why Donald Trump, because he's not a good businessman. He's a reality TV show host. He's not very well educated. As Dr. Lewis said perfectly, he doesn't have a plan for most of anything, right? What makes him so appealing? What about the identity politics is he hooking people in? And he's actually anti-science, anti-intellectual, and he's very vocal about that, right? Like, I'm not interpreting that. He's very out there, and he runs his presidency like a reality TV show. So why do you think that that's working for 42% of white people?
I'll clearly, unequivocally, and unapologetically say it's because of racism. So we have this false presumption that because we elected a Black president, that we are in a post-racist society. Racism is infused in the very fabric of the United States. When we wrote our founding document, it then therefore said that if you were not white, you were equivalent to a table or a chair. You were property. You were not even full human. Right. Racism has been in our laws at least through 1968. And that was in an overt way, and it's still there, according to the Department of Justice finding from the Ferguson report, in a very covert way now. So racism has, when you talk about the American democracy, if you have that discussion absent racism, you're having an incomplete discussion.
Oh, no, you're right about that.
What happened was racism became, overt racism became frowned upon in the public sphere. What Donald Trump is appealing to, and this is not an endorsement of Joe Biden or any candidate. What he's appealing to, though, is the latent racism behind some people and allowing that to be okay. And that is a very dangerous thing, because words matter. Words, we've seen this year that when he incites people to violence, it literally leads to the deaths of other people. So what he has done is he has made it okay to be racist and to be upfront about it. And that's how he's courting the majority of his white voters.
But I would argue with you that almost every president, excluding Barack Obama, made it okay to be racist. I don't see.
Oh,
Uh,
but
I don't see Bill
it's in a
Clinton
very different way.
super
When it
predators
comes,
or.
yeah, when it comes to Trump, it's in a very different way. It's in a very different way because he personifies everything that they believe that they are. And so what I mean by
Okay.
what I mean by that as a personification is that he um in some ways is he's not Ivy League, right? So he's not of this although he did go to Penn or bought a degree or whatever you want to call it, right? He's not of however you want to slice and dice it.
You're not lying,
He
so go on.
Right, but you have to understand that if we look at the history of presidents, I think if I'm not mistaken, over half of our presidents have attended an Ivy League school, right?
Mhm.
Over 50% of them, I mean, over half of them have done so. Trump represents the exact opposite of that, right? Yes, he was born in a silver spoon in his mouth, but in many ways, his father, Fred Trump, was not known outside of New York. um he as the guy as a millionaire or a billionaire or whatever lies he wants to tell, either way it goes, his father was not known outside of New York, right? Trump as a man with this whole idea of being pulled up from his own bootstraps and all of that comes from the idea that he took the Trump name and stretched it across the United States, right? Everything was about for him the appearance of wealth, the appearance of power, right? And that is what people are attracted to. They're not necessarily attracted to the hard work of governing. They're attracted to the Hollywood effect that Donald Trump presents and that he represents. And for many of them, he personifies all of the things. He skirts the rules. He believes in not being politically correct, right? So this whole idea of racism being an overt action, he has now cloaked that into political correctness versus what it is. It's vile bigotry, right? Instead of he has made it sexy again, and he's made it sexy again by saying that it's not politically correct. I'm going to be the person that does not side with the political correctness. I'm going to be the person that gives the middle finger then to all of these Ivy League people who think that they're smarter than us. I'm going to give a middle finger to all of the rules, right? Because the rules are what's holding us back in this country, and that we need to skirt the rules so that then we can be on top again. So all of the things that he represents is what is racism personified. It's white supremacy personified, and it's belligerence 2.0, right? And that is what we have not really seen in the modern day history, even with modern day racists. If you think about Ronald Reagan, or want to call him a racist, or if you think about Nixon, think about him as a racist, you don't see any of the level of flamboyancy in those two that you see in Donald Trump. You do not see a disregard for human life, right? So if I were to make it plain, they faked it, right? In a way that Donald Trump is not faking it. And that is what many of the white electorate that vote for him want. They do not want people to fake how they really feel, especially when it comes to the issue of race.
Yeah. And I'm not going to, as Dr. Lewis said, I'm not going to not pick on Biden here, because then that's the next question. How's Biden manipulating identity politics to work in his favor and bring more voters to his campaign?
I think one of the things he did very earlier on to manipulate was he packed his staff with minority folks. I mean, one can call it manipulation, another person can call it strategy, right? He
Mhm.
was very keen early on with packing his team with a diverse set of with a diverse set of folks. And we've seen how that's played out, right? The reason that Jim Clyburn was able to come to his rescue when it comes to South Carolina is because of the relationships that he had with inside of the Black community, and made very early on, I would argue, with who he hired, right? He had a very diverse staff. If you look at his starting staff, I mean, there may have been 2 or 3 white people at the beginning of who he hired. And so what he's been able to do, I think, from the very beginning is co-opt many of the Obama people. He's been able to take many of the disconcerted Bernie people that were of color and made a coalition out of them that has made it easier then to reach subsets of voters where his voice didn't have to because of the surrogates that he employed very early on.
I will totally agree with Dr. Nelson. Joe Biden has done what most universities do across university, across the country. When universities want to make pamphlets and brochures and advertisements, they take their 10 black people and they make sure that they're in that pamphlet or that brochure. And that's exactly what Joe Biden has done. He has taken what he considers, I think this is slightly offensive, but what he considers is the most qualified of black people, and he made they are out there in the front and in the forefront. He makes sure they are visible. He is saying, see, look, I don't just say I've done more for black people. I'm actually giving black people six-figure salaries. I'm actually putting them in charge of my campaign. And really, Joe Biden doesn't have to campaign. All he has to do is not mess up.
Right.
Right.
And so having these black people in position is really, to some degree, having figureheads. They don't have to come up with an actual national strategy. They just have to come up with a strategy to limit damage. That's all they have to do. And he has done this photo op game by constantly putting, even you see his commercials on TV now, his commercials are very racially diverse. And all of that is intentional because he is you may call him manipulating, strategizing. He is playing to this appeal of identity politics.
But he will not. Okay, sorry, I was just going to say, but he will not go all the way to the progressive platform. So
and that's the point I want to chime in on. Thank you, Dr. Hernandez, because we don't need to be in some type of fairy tale thinking that either of these candidates are going to wave a magic wand and end racism.
Right.
Let's just be honest about our options here. We have two mediocre old white men whom we have to pick from. And both of them have some questionable past about race. Donald Trump has literally endorsed the Proud Boys, defended KKK and neo-Nazis. He has said critical race theory is pointless and claimed there's no systemic racism in America. And then on the other hand, Joe Biden, if you go back to when he's in the Senate, he literally said, I'll be damned if I feel any responsibility for what happened 300 years ago. Meaning he didn't support reparations. He didn't support affirmative action policies. He was actually against the integration of schools. So we have two candidates who, to some degree, both have a very sketchy past when it comes to race. So don't expect on November 4th for you to wake up and racism to be gone. That is not going to happen.
Well, let me also say this as well, because the benefit of what I believe in Joe's case that Trump doesn't have, to me, is the fact that he's been in public life for over 40 years. So although he may have made that statement, there's also a recording of him going off on the State Department about South Africa and our position during apartheid, right? So my thing when it comes to Joe is that politics is the art of the possible. And it's about who can we push and who can we get something out of. And Donald Trump has made it very clear we can't get anything out of him. So for me, it's not for me, it's about who can I push and where can I push them to? And I'm very clear that one president, two presidents, three presidents are not going to erase racism. Racism is in the fabric of the country. It is written inside of the Constitution. We had to get constitutional amendments to get rid of the fact that racism was written inside of its document. We have to acknowledge that Mississippi, a state, just ratified the 13th Amendment within the last 10 years. So let's not put this burden on any one president, no matter who it is, right? Because the idea that one or two presidents are going to erase something that's written into the fabric of the country is absurd to begin with. But let's also understand that Joe Biden is 78 years old, and if we have a 78-year-old that wants to change his mind about something, let's use that to our advantage and push him at every angle and at every opportunity. Because I don't know too many 78-year-olds who are willing to listen to anything.
That's true. Very true. My question kind of goes back to using that manipulation of the identity politics. So there's been evidence, I'm putting that in air quotes because I know it's kind of sketchy evidence of Donald Trump actually paying people to show up at his rallies who are either Latinx or Black to try to make himself look diverse. However, if you look at his cabinet, if you look at his campaign, if you look at all the people around him, they're all very, very white people, right? And there's pretty ladies and then lots of white men and old white men, right? So how do you think that actually plays out to his base and to the people who are maybe undecided? Do you think that that kind of tactic works and it will be effective, or do you not see, or do you think people see through that?
Oh, I think people see through that, and I think people see through that because of the scholarship of folks like Tim and I, right?
Mhm.
Before we got on today, Tim and I discussed the fact that Donald Trump has appointed 200 judges to the federal court, whether at the appellate level and also including the one he stole and the one he's trying to ram through right now. Okay,
Mhm.
so when we say are people looking through it? Yes, people are looking through it because people can see. This is if we're in the information age, we're in a place now where your computer is in your hand, and so there may be people who may not want to acknowledge it. There may be people that may not want to have a conversation about it. But do people see it? Absolutely, because everybody is watching while you push 200 judges. everybody's watching how you didn't even let Ruth Bader Ginsburg's body get cold before you were talking about who you're going to replace her with. So and a woman who, for all intents and purposes, would have retired had you not became the president. So
Mhm.
let's be very clear that no, people are not disillusioned or buying it, right? It's really it's the red meat to his base, and that is why they have participated in so many schemes to then try to win, right? We've seen in the state of California, a progressive state, where Republicans have set up boxes for fake ballot for have set up fake boxes so people can put their ballots inside of them and they can throw those ballots away. In California, a state that's progressive, how do I know? Because I'm still a voter in California and will be flying back to vote in November, and will be flying back on the day so that I can actually take my ballot and put it inside of the box, because I already see the levels of games that are being played. And so for me, are people buying it? No, people are not buying it. And that is why they're coming up with the grandest of schemes to try to win.
Yep.
This is, I said earlier that I didn't know if this was manipulation or strategy or whatever. It's manipulation. Uh,
Mhm.
when you look concretely at the makeup of those around President Trump, um, there are no black people around President Trump. There are no indigenous people. There are no
None.
Asian or Latinx people. And Sherice brings up a good point when it comes to the courts. When we often think of the president and the courts, we often jump to the Supreme Court. And we totally miss that each president appoints dozens of lifetime appointments to district and appellate courts. And President Trump has a total of 200 federal appointments. That's to the Supreme Court and 198 to district and appellate courts. Of all his appellate court appointments, not one person is black. And if you expect us to hallucinate to think that there are no qualified black judges to sit in federal benches, then you are insulting our intelligence. People appoint to places to make decisions it is direct evidence of how they really think about these identity groups that they're discussing. So yes, you can get on a microphone and you can say you've done more for black people. You can take credit for Barack Obama's starting of the HBCU funding. You can take credit for criminal justice reform, which isn't reform at all, it just has it in the title. You can do all of these things, but when you don't appoint people of color to certain positions to make decisions for people, then that's a telltale sign you are using race as a tool to get votes and you have no interest in the advancement of racial minorities.
And let me take that even a step further. And the reason I want to take this a step further is because he stole not only a Supreme Court seat from Barack Obama, but he stole appellate seats. He stole district, federal district seats from Obama because many of the people that Obama appointed who were Black sat and were not confirmed inside of Mitch McConnell's Senate. So let's also be very clear. The reason that he was able to appoint over these 200, over 100 of them, is because he let many of them go unappointed while Mitch McConnell was running the Senate, right? Obama set a record, and Tim brought this to my attention. I didn't know it was this many. I knew that Obama had the record for the number of Black judges that were appointed, but I didn't know it was 62. So in 8 years, he was able to get 62 Black judges then confirmed for lifetime appointments. Yet Mitch McConnell has allowed then for those 62 to be eclipsed because of the number that they allowed to go on, not even get a hearing, not even allowed to then be examined, have been eclipsed by the fact. And so are people paying attention? Yes, people are paying attention. Why do you think in Georgia right now in early voting, where in Fulton County, they have now 2 places to vote? 2 places. They shut down 4 of the other places to vote in Fulton County. There's 2. People are waiting in line for 5 hours for early voting. My sister is from, well, my sister lives in the Atlanta area. They are waiting 4 and 5 hours to vote happily. So no one's falling for it. Everyone is seeing what it is, and actually it's galvanizing a certain set of people who normally do not vote.
Yeah. And I want to get to voter suppression, but I don't want to miss the Supreme Court justice piece, right? So we're going to get there. But a colleague of mine in the Dream Collective showed me the video yesterday, and I have to get your guys' opinion on this, of Amy, whatever, ABC, ACB, whatever her name is, introducing her family. And as you know, she has 2 Black children she adopted from Haiti, and she decided to introduce her children. Did you guys see that? Okay, so she introduced her white children and talked about, and her biological white children, and talked about their intelligence and their potential and their careers. And when she introduced her 2 adopted Haitian children, she talked about how horrible their existence was in Haiti and then how athletic they are. So I would love your guys' opinion on what that says about her, not only in her character, but in her role as SCOTUS, possibly.
Yeah, and as a mother, I would love to take this one first.
Go for it.
So let me make sure I stay tempered. So my first problem with it was my first problem with this entire show was when Pence first used it against Kamala in the debate. When he made the note, oh yeah, she's going to bring her family, to Washington, or whatever his comment was. That was what we call in the Black community a little shade. That was shade because Kamala Harris does not have her own set of biological children. So I had a problem with this whole parading of children from the very beginning. I don't care what color they are. I have a problem with parading children because children they're innocent. They have nothing to do with the process. If you decide to get yourself inside, if you decide to run for office, if you decide to be in the public eye, your children should not be a spectacle regardless of what their colors are. So that was my first problem with it, was when Pence tried to low ball or low dig or shade Kamala on the fact that Amy, can't be defective because she's been able to have, children, right? So that was the first problem that I had with it.
Right.
Then the idea that we need to meet your children in a hearing is a problem for me as well. I still don't understand why they need to be introduced in a hearing where we're making a decision about if you can upkeep the Constitution. I don't understand what your children have anything to do with that. So then I had a problem with the children, regardless of color, being introduced, period. Then let's go a step further as to why did you feel that you need to play white savior and go save 2 Haitian kids anyway? So let's now go to that factor of your positionality as white savior, where you felt like it behooved you not to save these two black children from the squalor that they were living in their horrible lives. So that was my next problem, is that you are now positioning yourself as white savior and wanting to be applauded for that positionality. And the audacity of you to put on record the lives that they lived, by living in a fishbowl with you, by knowing every day that they are not your biological children, because they can just look at you and see that they're not biologically yours. The level of the level of scrutiny that you have brought upon them. What kind of mother are you? Mm-hmm. That is my question. We can go, it has nothing to do with what you're going to do on the court. My question to you about your character is, what type of mother are you that you would allow for that level of scrutiny to your child? Your job as a mother is to protect those children. So what does it say to me? It says that you're an opportunist. It says that you're an opportunist. It says that you will say one thing and do another. And I don't trust anything that she says in a hearing or otherwise. And that to me speaks to just the core of you, who you are as a woman, regardless of your color.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This is an emotionally frustrating topic for two reasons. The first reason is this notion of the white savior complex. The white savior complex is this notion that what is white saves or racial minorities from adverse conditions, because what is white is safe, secure, and that's the only way that you can advance in this world. When you look at history, all of the great inventions of history happen outside of whiteness.
Come on.
Astrology happened from the Egyptians. Our modern use of architecture comes from the Chinese and the Zimbabwean kingdoms of South Africa. Our notions of boating come from the West African, who hundreds of years before Columbus knew how to transverse the Atlantic Ocean over to what is now South America. When you think about it, even in the United States, it was a black woman by the name of Katherine Johnson who developed the mathematical equation to get white men to the moon. It was a black man by the name of Charles Drew who developed the blood transfusion and then in turn died because he couldn't get a blood transfusion. And then when white people ran the economy into the ground, it was Barack Obama who saved us from the greatest recession since the Great Depression. This notion that we need to be saved from white people is frustrating. If anything, we have saved you all throughout all of history. And I am so sick and tired of this complex that we need to be saved. White is not right. White is not the only thing that is cultured. White does not preserve humanity. When you look at history, most of our diseases, from bloody flux to syphilis, came from Europe. The Black Plague, Europe. White people have done historically the most damage to the world than any group of people. So we don't need you to save us. So now that I've done that rant,
there you go. I knew I asked the right two people to talk to you about this. Yes, thank you.
Let me talk about Amy Coney Barrett. So I do believe that Amy is racist. One, we need to get away from this narrative that proximity to blackness means you're not racist.
Come on.
This notion, I have black friends, I have black family members, I'm not racist. Thomas Jefferson was literally in love with Sally Hemings and then put his own biracial children into slavery. So if you can enslave your own children, racism is about benefiting from a system. It's not about personal like or dislike of someone. So let me tell you how Amy Coney Barrett is racist. Last year, not 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, last year, that was a case in Illinois called Smith versus the Illinois Department of Transportation, in which Amy Coney Barrett sat on the appellate court and decided that decision. Now, the crux of this case is that Smith was filing a discrimination suit against the Illinois Department of Transportation because his supervisor called him a nigger.
Right.
Do you know what Amy decided? Who wrote the opinion for this case? Let me read you what she decided.
I can't wait.
She says that being called a nigger is insufficient evidence for discrimination. The black person, who is the victim, must demonstrate that the use of the word alter the conditions of his employment. And that is in the holding of Smith versus Illinois Department of Transportation. She doesn't believe that being called the N-word is sufficient evidence for discrimination, that the victim, the black person, must then show additional evidence that the N-word led to a change in condition in the workplace. That is racism personified.
Well, let's go even further. Why would she believe that being called a nigger was going to be grounds then for discrimination when she clerked for a man by the name of Anthony Scalia, who said without hesitation that black people did not belong in the academy? He was very clear on this in an affirmative action case, and I should have come with my receipts for when he said it. Anthony Scalia said that blacks were not meant or not capable of performing inside of the academy. Well, I guess, Tim, that means that me and you can't teach because we both there. So it's not surprising to me that Amy would make such a statement, or that she would say in court holdings that the use of a racial epithet is not enough evidence for discrimination, because she clerked for a man who believed that black people were subhuman. So why is it then surprising? I mean, my mama used to tell me all the time, if it looked like a duck and walked like a duck and quacked like a duck, then it's either a duck or it's impersonating a duck. And my thing is, I don't understand how much more we need her to quack for us to know what it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, you brought up an interesting point about black and being in the academy, and especially in your political science, so especially within your disciplines.
Which is a racist field. It's a racist field, a field that was constructed racially.
Right. So that's why, really, if you feel up to it, don't feel pressured, because I don't want to be marketing or looking at any kind of racial trauma as a way to benefit, but to really hear the story. I think the viewers might be interested if you have a story you're willing to share with us about your experience in the academy.
Oh, absolutely. So I told this story before, and I have no problem telling it again. When I and it's going to be a little emotional story for those of you. When I interviewed for an adjunct, first let me say that I'm assistant professor at Southern University. I adjuncted for a while because I just wasn't a good fit inside of white academic spaces. I'm historically Black college educated, and so I come with a certain level of edge because of the history that I was taught. Right, I wasn't miseducated. And because I wasn't, there's a certain level of edge that I come with, and certain expectations that I have that often make people uncomfortable. And so, make a long story short, I was interviewing for a job to teach African politics. And when I arrived at the job interview, I was extremely nervous. My sister was getting married, and my hair was in its natural state. My nails weren't done. I didn't have any makeup on my face, any of the things, because I was literally getting ready to within the next day or so, fly to Las Vegas for my sister's wedding and perform all the, wedding rituals, get all dressed there and all the makeup, hair, everything else. And I had this job interview, and I remember walking up the stairs, and the chair of the department at the time was visually impaired. And I remember saying, "Oh, Dr. Hasham, I did not know that you were visually impaired." And he goes, "That's okay, Sherice. You could just say that I'm blind. I'm blind." And I laughed and I said, "Oh, well, that makes me be a little more relaxed." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, because I'm not physically presenting how I would normally like to present. I just, I'm getting ready for the wedding, so I don't look like how I would normally like to look." And he said to me, "Don't worry, now I can really see you." And that was such an emotional moment for me, because every time I show up anywhere, my hair is assessed, my figure is assessed, my makeup, the amount of makeup, the not amount of makeup is assessed, how long my nails are is assessed, the cadence of my speech is assessed. Every time I show up, I am, as Dr. Lewis says, I am keen to the nonverbal communication that shows up anytime I enter a room. And I have to make a decision constantly that I'm not going to allow it to push me off my game, or that I'm not going to allow it to define who I really am. Because that is what the academy is, I think, for Black scholars. It is a place where we are consistently wondering, who am I going to piss off today? Right? Who am I going to piss off today just by my sheer presence? Not what I get ready to say, but my sheer presence, I know, is going to make somebody uncomfortable. And how much am I going to internalize that? And how much am I going to not take that into consideration? And so Amy Barrett, as a person, is a white woman that I've seen in academia several times over. She is a white woman that claims to be colorblind. A white woman that has been placed in positions of authority because of not only her whiteness but because of her gender. Because let's remember that Amy Barrett has not even been was appointed by Trump at the beginning of his presidency, so she hasn't even sat on the at the appellate level for any length of time. I think it's been 2 years. And so what I know about Amy Barrett is she's the same white woman that I have passed in the halls of white named buildings on academic campuses throughout the country.
I hear you. I hear you.
I don't want to recount an individual incident of racism in the academy, because what I'm starting to see, and this is manifested where I'm currently employed at SIUE, is that when you recount an incident of racism, there's a presumption that that's not an indictment of the entire system, that that's an isolated incident. And we have to get past this notion that when racism happens, it's an isolated incident. Racists only avow their racism in environments they are comfortable enough to do it in.
Exactly.
So if you have repeated individual incidents of racism, that's a sign that those people feel comfortable enough to perform the racism at your particular institution. And so there are two ways in which academia is racist. The first one is the use of standardized testing. There should be no use of standardized testing in the United States. It is well known and well documented that standardized testing disadvantages Black students. Why is that? Are Black students less intelligent? No, that's how it was designed. The individual who designed the SAT was a person who believed in eugenics, that the size of people's heads determined how intellectual they were. And because Black people, had circular eye orbs and round nasal cavities, that they were less intellectual than whites. That's preposterous. The very test is designed to disadvantage people of color, yet we still use it, and then we try to justify the use of it. The second thing that makes the academy racist is tenure. John Dewey invented the process of tenure to keep white elites at a level different than everybody else in academia. And when he talked about racism, he talked about it as the plight of the African Americans, that was a Black issue and racism didn't matter to white people. Two clear manifestations of racism that clearly define the academy, and that for some reason administrators don't want to get rid of. Administrators will literally write in the policies that tenure may evoke racist, sexist, and homophobic thoughts from students, and then will justify the use of the tenure process. The academy is designed to be racist. Think about this. When John Dewey was developing tenure, or when some of our earlier founding fathers were starting these institutions of higher learning, do you really think they were sitting around and thinking, let's see, I want the most fair system because I want my Black slave one day to be able to get a degree.
Right.
I want the most fair system because I want those Native Americans, those indigenous people to have the same opportunity I do. No, they were not thinking about that. So you have a system made outside the consideration of racial minorities, but you expect racial minorities to perform at the same level as whites within the racist system. That's a paradox.
And but Tim, the reason not only is it a paradox, the crazy part is that we actually outperform. There are several instances, right, where we can pull up Black scholars who have outperformed, where there has to be an entire movement to get them to get tenure. for them to then be uncomfortable in the same place that they've pushed and fought in. Again, if we go back to the court, it's the same process. And this is the thing that I guess I get frustrated with, is that we think that racism works differently. It works the same. It's just in different places. It works the exact same way. It works this way. I need to create a system. Well, I need to invent a system, because see, I truly believe that white people don't create; they just invent. So I need to invent a system that is then going to make it. And so, if I see many of you laughing, the reason I say that is this:
because you're not wrong.
Right, but creation is taking something and is taking nothing and turning it into something. That is the literal meaning of to create. And if we look back in history, as Dr. Lewis, I should say, has eloquently done previously in this segment, have talked about all the things that white folks did not create. Right. One of the things that I used to send to white students as soon as I would teach them is a day in the life without Black people. You wouldn't have your cell phone. You wouldn't have a GPS. You wouldn't have GPS. You wouldn't have a stoplight. You wouldn't have. There's all the stuff you wouldn't have that you're using every day if it wasn't if Black people didn't exist, right? And so what I mean is that Black people create where white people invent. And so, to Tim's point, they invent systems that allow them to stay in a place of power and at a place at the top. They invent systems, right? Which is what the patent office is. It is a system that allows me to steal your creation and make it mine, right? That is what is done. It is the invention. And so what frustrates, I think, many white people is that even once you've invented a system to keep me to be inferior, I bust your system open too. And then that is where I think there's a lot of the intention, because it's like, wait a minute, how is this possible? I have invented a system based upon the fact that I know that you outcreate me. I know you outcreate me. And since I know you outcreate me, I've invented a system in which I still can win, and you win there too. Well, wait a minute. There's a problem. And I think that's what we're at. I think that's the moment that we're at in history. We're at a moment in history where people that are white are realizing what we invented didn't even work. So now what do we do?
Well, and speaking of that, because you're talking about that distinction between invention and creation, which was very powerful. So thank you for kind of unpacking that. When they invented their democracy, right, and they set it up for white male property owners, Christians, that was it, right, as they set it up. They have used consistently throughout the time of our country ways to suppress certain people's ability to vote, right? So I want to go back to what you were talking about in California, where they've got the weird kind of looking official ballot boxes, right? That they can then steal those ballots from. That, of course, is not new. So I would love to hear from both of your guys' perspective of the effectiveness of voter suppression, how it's been used, how it's been invented and then reinvented over our last 600-year history.
Yeah, so let's I'm going to leave the history to Tim. I want to start off with no, because Tim is so eloquent. He'll read down the timeline. He is really eloquent. It's not even worth, right, Jennifer, right. It's not even worth playing with him like that. So I'm going to stay in my lane, and what I'm going to start with is why voter suppression to begin with, right? Mm-hmm. Why suppress the vote? And I think this is what many people do not understand. Voting is what then signifies you're a citizen. It is the signifier of citizenship. And the reason that I say that is because I have a book that's coming out called The Congressional Black Caucus, 50 Years for Fighting for Equality. And in that book, I do a very brief history and talk about Black citizenship. And Black citizenship was tied directly then to their ability to vote. So why voter suppression? Because if you vote, then what does that mean? That means that you can serve on a jury. That means that you decide who is the district attorney. That means you decide who's the judge that's hearing that case. That also then means that you are counted, that you are more likely than not to be counted in the census, right? So why is the voter suppression a tool? Why is it something that we see reinvented year after year after year after year, or a decade after decade, or era after era after era? Because it's literally the foundation of the democracy. What then makes you a citizen inside of the country, the ability is then to vote, which is why we took it away from felons, because then I can remove your citizenship. And this is what it's all about. It's about making it so that you cannot be a citizen. So voter disenfranchisement, voter suppression is all about taking numbers and making those numbers be less minority, meaning that there's less people of color inside of those numbers, so that then I can justify, when I use a different system, to then justify who I'm going to call the winner of an election. And I do that again to deny your citizenship. Now, I will leave the floor open to Dr. Lewis so he can give us the history of when voter suppression started, and why it reinvents itself. But I want to be very clear here as to why it's necessary, or why it's the tool used.
Yeah, and to your point, I remember when my grandfather came over from Guadalajara, Mexico, the biggest important thing for him was to be as white as possible so nobody could see his Mexican heritage, even though he looked that way, and to be a citizen. It was about voting for him. So interesting. But yeah. Tim, I think we lost Dr. Nelson for a hot second. Maybe she'll get back to us. But in the meantime, maybe you can enlighten us on the invention and reinvention of voter suppression.
As Dr. Nelson said, voter suppression is not new.
Mm-hmm.
When the founding fathers developed what they call a democracy, they had voter suppression in mind. When you look at the history of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, two people came to the Constitutional Convention already with two constitutions drawn up. That is James Madison and William Patterson. Both of them came up with their own plan. And in both plans, they wanted to prevent certain populations from being able to engage in certain votes. One only wanted certain states to vote, and then another only wanted certain demographics to vote. So voter suppression is not new. Here's the thing about it. Systems and those who operate systems have given people the illusion that there is no voter suppression. So let's just let's just take one group, African Americans, and walk through how they suppress the votes of African Americans. Okay, so first we could not vote because we were not deemed humans. So at the Constitutional Convention, the debate was, do we count Black people when we count, representation for the House of Representatives? So the compromise was, no, you can't, because for every one white person, there were 10 slaves in the South. There's no way we can count these people. So we're going to count 3/5 of those persons, which means they're not full people, which means they can't vote. So then after the Civil War, we're going to give Black males the right to vote, but then we're going to issue poll taxes and literacy tests, and we're going to write into the 13th Amendment that I can still enslave you as punishment for a crime. It actually says that in the 13th Amendment. So then I'm going to make you a felon because I'm going to arrest you for loitering. And then when you try to defend yourself, I'm going to say you're resisting arrest. I'm going to make you a felon. Therefore, you can't vote. This happened from 1887 all the way up until 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was passed. After 1965, we have this notion of we need to reinforce this notion that Black people are evil, Black people are savagery. So coming out of 65, you had this very liberal movement all running. You had Black people gaining rights to vote. You had LGBT people who were protesting, beginning at Stonewall going forward. You had women advocating for sexual liberty. You had all these things happen. So then you had what's called the Conservative Reclamation, which was code for let white people stay in charge. And so as a result of the Conservative Reclamation, we got all kinds of laws that either started then or years after, everything from the three strikes rule forward. So we put in places ways to take away people's right to vote, but we coded it as a punishment for a crime.
Did he freeze?
I think he froze a little bit.
Yeah. So let me pick up where he left off about this idea of it being wrapped as a punishment for a crime. It has been wrapped such a way because you've had to justify why make such a decision. And you've had to justify why make such a decision. You've had to justify why make such a decision because it's wrapped in this idea of punishment, because we have said to ourselves that to be savage, to be inconsiderate, to be all of these things then deserve punishment. So if we were to back up a little bit, one of the biggest reasons we were able to make in this system Black folks to be savages was because of their because they did not appear to then know Christianity the same way that white men did. And so that then allowed then for the label of savage or the categorization of savage. And what do savages do? Savages do things that are outside of societal norms, and savages do things that are outside societal norms that then deserve punishment. So I want to make it very clear that the reason that I have to wrap the justification in punishment is because I have to then I have to make it justifiable. If I first say that all men are created equal, then I have to then explain why these set of men are not necessarily created that way. Right. And so what Tim is describing here is a justification for the evils in which they invented a system to remain superior and to remain supreme. Go ahead, Tim. I just was filling in while you dropped off.
Thank you. Just think about this fact. 40% of the prison population is African-American males. Not the jail population, not for misdemeanor offenses held overnight, no, of the prison population. That means these people are likely felons. So what you've done is you've taken almost half of an entire demographic out of the picture, and you denied them the right to vote. And even once you give them the right to vote back, like Florida does, you put in another suppression mechanism, say they have to pay all of these excessive fees, which you know they don't have. So voter suppression is part of the American system. And I'm going to talk about this a little more tomorrow on Diversity Day, but we have to get out of this mode of trying to fix the system.
Right. That's that.
The system, you don't.
It's not broken. It's working.
Exactly. The system isn't broken. It's working how it was designed to work. You need a new system.
That makes the current one irrelevant. That's what has to happen. But I want to take this because you guys are my political science experts. You're going to be able to answer this. My argument, and when we talk about voter suppression, is I want to argue that with the onset of Citizens United and the use of gerrymandering, there is voter suppression within the constructs of how we decide. If you add the layer of the Electoral College on top of that, the whole system is designed to really allow only the privileged of the privileged to vote.
Well, Ron Walters, the orchestrator, the architect of the Congressional Black Caucus, wrote back in the early 80s about how the Electoral College would actually benefit Black folks if we all lived in one place. And what we are seeing is that exact thing. We are seeing a reverse migration amongst Blacks. And my argument is that is one of the biggest reasons that we're seeing the level of pushback that we're seeing back in the same demographic area, in the same geographical area, is because of the reverse migration. What we are seeing right now in Georgia can turn into a toss-up state. Why did we get the level of cheating that we did in the governor's race? We got that level of cheating because of the fact that so many Black people are now moving back to places in the South that is turning these traditionally red states into purple states, into toss-up areas. And so if you think about it from this perspective, right? If we think about it from the idea of for instance, let me go here. Virginia had voted red until the Barack Obama election, and it has not gone back red since. It has been blue even in 2016 when it went for Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. What we are seeing is in the southern states that many of them, if they're not already blue, they are turning into purple places where minorities are packing. So if we think about the Electoral College from that perspective, California, which is already blue, New York, which is already blue. If you take those two states and then start to cobble together many of these southern states where blacks are the majority or minorities are the majority, if you even think about Texas, you can even lose inside of the Electoral College, and that is what is going. That is what to me the real reckoning is as to why Shelby v. Holder is important, and as to why it was necessary in their minds in 2012 to then push back to then gut the Civil Rights Act of 1965, get rid of pre-clearance, get rid of the formula, all of those things, because they see the level of migration that's happening, and they know it's happening because in 2010, if you read the book called Red Map, they talk about how they carved districts out, particularly because they saw the phenomenon of many people that were black and that many of us that are black and brown were moving in particular areas in the South where they even had to cut districts in particular ways to even continue to win. So, and we see that, and I guess the last point I'll make on that is Lucy Bath. Lucy Bath in Georgia right now is in the seat, and I can't remember the number because it's changed since Newt Gingrich, but she's sitting right now in Newt Gingrich's seat. Lucy Bath, the mother of Jordan Davies, who was shot and killed in Florida because his music was too loud. She is currently in the House of Representatives, and I think it's District 6, if I'm not mistaken, District 6 in Georgia. That is a toss-up district now that was once controlled by Newt Gingrich, who was the Speaker of the House. Right? Who brought in a wave of new rules inside of the House to then tamp back or to stamp back the level of power the Congressional Black Caucus and other ethnic caucuses were getting inside of that chamber. So what we know to be the case is that the Electoral College could actually work in minorities' favor if they start moving to places or organizing in particular states, which we see is happening.
Gotcha. That is amazing. I'm glad to see that. Feels like progress for sure.
Well, yeah, we can look at North Carolina, right? Mm-hmm. Look at North Carolina, look at Texas, look at Georgia, right? We knew that this was possible or that this was happening with Doug Jones. Doug Jones was our indicator that the migration has been effective. Because we got a white man to become the senator of the state of Alabama off the back, really, of black women out of Selma, Alabama.
Awesome. Dr. Lewis, anything you want to add to the Citizen United gerrymandering, voter suppression trifecta?
I would just say that voter suppression is behind. It is at the core of why conservatives are against DC becoming a state.
Oh yeah,
it's right. It's more than 50% African American, and they are fearful if it becomes a state, and that automatically gives votes to the Electoral College, more votes in terms of representation, more votes in terms of that won't go their way. So it's another form of voter suppression.
Absolutely.
Same thing with Puerto Rico. If you want to be very clear about it, I mean, it's the same reason that we don't want Puerto Rico to become a state. Right? Absolutely. We do not want Puerto Rico to become a state because of those same things. And I'm glad Dr. Lewis brought up DC statehood, because there again is an example of Black legislators pushing legislation that is about equity and fairness inside of the legislature, right? That piece of legislation has been brought up almost in every session since the Congressional Black Caucus was founded in 1971. I think the first time they put it up for a vote was in 74. They've put it up every single year. Walter Fauntroy, who was a delegate before Eleanor Norms Horton, had put that bill up several times. And that is how, in many ways, that we got the Homestead Act, where DC was able then to govern themselves. And at that time, the city was like 80% Black. Black, right? Right now, the city is 62% Black, but at the time when the Homestead Act was passed, the city was overwhelmingly, it was, we see in DC now because of gentrification, right? I attended Howard University, so we're seeing gentrification happen in Washington, DC, yet and still, it is still a predominantly Black city. And so I think that, I'm glad that Dr. Lewis brought up DC and DC statehood, because it's passed the House and it's sitting in Mitch McConnell's graveyard of bills. I think, what is it, Tim, now at this point, 200, 300 bills that he hasn't that he hasn't even assigned to committees. They're literally sitting in a graveyard, not even being assigned to committee to be heard. So they see their handwritings on the wall. And in 2004, when Republicans had the opportunity to embrace, in many ways, some of the issues of the Latinx community, they could have made themselves a party that was viable to continue to win. And they were so hell-bent to remain the party of white supremacy that they did not reach out an olive branch to then bring Latinx folks inside of the tent. And because they didn't do that, they've had to then rig the system even further, or rig the system even more, to ensure some level of victory.
Thank you both for such a powerful conversation about something so important. I mean, what are we, 20 days away from Election Day? Or is it less than that? Maybe it's 16. So yeah, thank you guys for taking your time today. I really appreciate it. In our last 15 minutes, we've had some questions come up from people watching, and I want to make sure you have an opportunity to answer those. So we'll get to the questions that are, so it says, a lot of my peers are deterred from voting because they know the candidates are playing identity politics. How can we help combat that?
I first would say, well, what do you expect them to do? I think there is this misnomer about how politics works, right? The point is to win, and the point is to put together strategies that are going to get you to win. How do you push back? You say, okay, if they're using that as a tool, then you use that a tool once they get elected to push legislators to get legislation that is going to affect your communities. If they're using it as a tool because it's powerful, then you use it as a tool once they are elected. It is the political process. If you think about Federalist 10, right? I just had my students read Federalist 10, or not read it because many of them didn't.
Students.
Right, who don't read, right? But if you think about Federalist 10, where they talk about factions. Factions are going to be are the realities of political processes. Special interest or interest are part of the political process. They are what it is. And the way that I get people to think about it, if we remove voting, or if we remove politics, let me say this, and I'll back up a little bit. Let me say this: politics is not the study of the government. Politics is the study of power. And politics is about who gets what, when, and where.
Yes.
That is what politics is. And so identity politics is a tool. It is a piece of power. It is a strategy used in that toolbox. And so my question then back to them is, how are you going to then use the same tool in your strategy inside of your toolbox as a piece of power? Because we know that's what politics is.
Great. Thank you, Kelsey, for your question. That was awesome. And thank you, Dr. Nelson, for your great answer. Next question is from Latisse. I hope I said that right. Joe Biden had said, if you don't vote for me, you're not Black. Do you both agree with the statement? Woo, that's a loaded question.
Well, I'll tee up for this one too. And the reason I'll tee up for this is because many people who were outside, this is kind of like, you know how when you are at home and they say, you know, what happens in this house stays in this house, it don't go outside. This was one of those kind of moments. And the reason I say that is because Joe Biden said that back to Charlemagne the God, and you have to question yourself, anybody who will call themselves such a name. But anyway, his response was because in many ways, Charlemagne the God, his affinity or his connection to the Black community has been questioned several times over. It is not his loyalty to the Black community has been questioned on several different platforms. So in many ways, it was a throwing of shade that wasn't then for Joe Biden to do. He shouldn't have made the comment. The comment wasn't something that he should have said, right? He deemed himself to be inside of the house when he really is not inside the house. He's still on the outside. And being Barack Obama's vice president is not going to get you on the inside, right? And so I think that it was a misplaced comment and a misreading of his positionality in this race.
Okay.
I will briefly say that one, we need to hold all candidates to the same standard. So Joe Biden was wrong for this, plain and simple. He should not have said this, and if he feels this way, that should be a red flag to some African American voters. But what I think, and this is just what I think, he was getting at is that a vote for Donald Trump is a vote against Black interests. If that's the message he was trying to convey, that's a message I would agree with. Again, I'm not endorsing any candidate, but I do believe that Trump does not have the interests of African Americans at heart.
This is the second time, Dr. Lewis, you mentioned that you don't endorse the candidate. Is that your practice because you're a political science scholar activist that you just will not share your own personal feelings about that?
My position has always been to give my listeners, whether they're students or community persons, give them information and let them decide for themselves and give them the most accurate information. When I say I'm not endorsing any candidate, that doesn't mean I'm not going to tell people who I support. What I'm telling you, when I say I don't endorse, I'm not asking you to follow in that support. That's what I mean by endorsement. But I will say and unapologetically say that I am a Democrat and I will be voting on the Democratic side of the ticket.
Thank you for sharing that. Oh, okay. So next question's from the Dream Collective. What recommendations do you have for the population of young adults who will be voting for the first time in this presidential election? Great question, because with COVID, with the civil unrest that's happened all summer, rightfully so, all of those things. Yeah. What does a first time voter do?
So I have two recommendations. The first one is vote early. And the reason I say this for your own safety, there is legitimate evidence that certain racist groups will try their best to evoke violence and hostility on election day. You are in a place, a district where you can vote early, and then stay home on election day. That's what I'm telling all of my students. Vote early, stay, especially if you are a person of color. Please vote early, then stay home on election day. The second thing I would say is then don't just vote. A lot of people frame the political participation as just voting. There's much more to it. Once you vote for someone, hold their feet to the fire. Call them, email them, critique them on social media, share their positives, share their negatives. You're paying these people's salaries through your taxes. You wouldn't go to Walmart and make a purchase and then come home and find it's defective and not take it back for what you purchased it for. So you need to hold these elected officials accountable once you cast that vote. That's only the beginning of your obligations as a politically informed citizen.
So the advice that I give all of my students who are in the process of voting, many of them voting right now, is remember this is a luxury. And I start off with that because I teach. I am not only just a race scholar. I'm an African diasporic scholar. So I look at the ways Black people have been affected throughout the world. And what I remind many of them is that you are participating in a luxury that people that look like you do not have throughout the world. So the very first thing is I remind them, this is a luxury. And this election should show you how much of a luxury it is, because people are trying to make it so that voting doesn't even exist. So that's the very first thing that I tell my students. I also remind them that there are people that have literally died in your families that you may not know of for this right. that black women and black men showed up to register to vote and were given a literacy test, or were asked to pay a poll tax, or were threatened with death, right? That the same things in many ways that you think that you're facing right now are not even on the same scale of what people in your family lineage, not just your ancestors, not just people that you know of, but in your family lineage, because I am in the state of Louisiana. And then the next thing that I tell students, my next set of evidence, or my next set of instructions, is to vote early and be prepared to wait. Do not, that in the voting early process, this is not a normal election. I know that you may be voting for the first time, but you're not going to be in and out of there for 10 or 15 minutes. You may have to wait in long lines. And I tell all of my male students, the same way you wait in line for them Jordans, wait in line to vote, to cast this vote.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no problem having those kind of conversations with them on a very real level, because your ability to buy Jordans and buy a cell phone may be gone if you are not participating in this election. And so those are things that I tell them. They probably get annoyed with me as being, the preachy professorial professor, but hey, when the shoe fits, you wear it.
That's right. Absolutely. If it walks like a duck,
if it walks like a duck,
that's right. In the last 5 minutes, I'm going to take the last question. And speaking to the same group of new young voters, what advice would you give them, especially Black, Indigenous, right, people of color, young first-time voters, since this is a very weird election for the typical of when this is passed, however it comes out, and the next candidates start to go? What advice would you give for how to choose a candidate that is going to represent your values? Because there is so much manipulation happening and strategies. How do you get through the weeds to see what you're really voting for?
Charles Diggs, one of the founding members of the Congressional Black Caucus, said that Black people do not have parties, they have permanent interest. And those permanent interests are built around healthcare, around the ability to be educated, around the ability to have access to a job, and the ability to have access to housing. And so when I tell students to look at who they're going to endorse for a candidate, whether it be the president, the mayor, the governor, is how do they measure up in those areas? How are they going to represent you, a person of color, whether you be Latinx, whether you be Indigenous, on these areas of education, healthcare, access to a job, and housing? What are they going to do that are going to deal with those things that are going to affect your life? Those are the areas that you should be looking at when you're deciding on a candidate, and if they align with what you believe is best for you in living in these United States.
Great. Thank you. Dr. Lewis, what would you say?
This may sound pessimistic.
I'm so surprised.
But all political officials, all elected officials, all aspiring officials, all of them lie. Mm-hmm. And, I think you should try to choose the one that lies less. And that may not sound like the most prophetic advice, but particularly, and this is not racist, this is historically factual. Particularly when white people lie, it has dangerous consequences for people of color. Mm-hmm. In 1955, when Carolyn Bryant lied on Emmett Till wound up dead. In 1923, when Fannie Taylor lied and said a Black man hit her, the entire town of Rosewood burned to the ground. In 1921, when Sarah Page lied on Dick Rowland, Tulsa, Oklahoma was bombed off the map. White lies throughout U.S. history have always led to Black deaths. So don't come to me with this, I'm sorry for my refabrication, I'm telling untruths, I misled you. You need to hold your officials accountable. When white people lie, black people die. So you need to find the most truthful person you can. They may not have every policy that you agree with, but truthfulness has been the one barrier between saving black lives and lives of color throughout American history. So please try to find the one that is the most truthful, even if their policies don't necessarily align all the way with yours. Because no politician is going to give you everything you want.
Wow, Dr. Lewis.
You're not voting for Jesus.
Right. That's right.
I mean, you're not. I mean, to Tim's point, you're not voting for Jesus. So, I mean,
right.
And for those of you that believe in Jesus, I know I do. So, I know that that's not who's going to be in the White House, right? And I think that's the disillusion. I think one of the biggest things that I always tell when I teach women in politics to the young girls, that I have a grandmother who's still living, who's 86 years old, who did not have her own bank account because she was married to my grandfather and could not open her own bank account until she was 32 years old. So there are some luxuries that we have that we take for granted and don't even understand them. To Tim's point, right? We do not understand the level of progress we have made and how that progress is still not enough.
Absolutely. Both of you, thank you for an illuminating, educating, powerful conversation, getting us ready to go up there and stand in that line and be ready to wait. So thank you both for your time. I want to apologize for the beginning of the webinar. We got a few minutes. We were cut off. We had some technical difficulties, but we got back on. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the hard work you do of just being alive and doing what you do. Thank you for your voices and your positionality. Have a great rest of the evening, and thanks to everybody who watched. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.